They avoidant realize they misjudged you, they are coming back with an opportunity for you, begins in a place most people never get to see, the exact moment an avoidant realizes the story they told themselves about you was wrong. Not dramatically, not all at once. It usually happens quietly, somewhere between loneliness and reflection, when the emotional noise finally dies down enough for clarity to enter the room. Because while you were loving them, reassuring them, trying to understand them, they were often filtering your behavior through fear instead of trust. Your consistency felt overwhelming instead of comforting. Your emotional openness felt dangerous instead of safe. Your desire for closeness felt like pressure instead of care. And the painful part is, avoidants usually do not realize this while they still have easy access to you. They realize it after distance, after silence, after enough time passes for their nervous system to stop reacting defensively and finally start seeing things clearly. That's when the memories begin replaying differently. The conversations they once labeled too emotional suddenly sound sincere. The patience they took for granted suddenly feels rare. The love they once questioned suddenly becomes impossible to replace emotionally. And if you've ever wondered whether an avoidant can eventually wake up and realize they misunderstood you completely, subscribe right now, because this channel is for the people who gave real love to emotionally guarded hearts and were left trying to understand what happened afterward. What most people never understand about avoidance is that they often misjudge genuine people because closeness activates fear inside them before it activates security. Their nervous system was trained to associate emotional dependency with risk. So when someone enters their life offering consistency, emotional availability, reassurance, and stability, avoidants often interpret those things through a distorted emotional lens. Instead of feeling safe, they feel exposed. Instead of appreciating emotional intimacy, they begin worrying about losing independence. And because this fear operates beneath conscious awareness much of the time, avoidants convince themselves the problem is the relationship instead of the emotional panic happening inside them. That's why they sometimes label deeply caring people as too much, while emotionally unavailable people feel strangely easier to handle. Emotional distance feels familiar to them. But healthy emotional closeness creates internal conflict because part of them wants it while another part fears being consumed by it. So during the relationship, they misread your intentions repeatedly. Your attempts to communicate became pressure. Your emotional needs became demands. Your consistency became something they subconsciously resisted because it threatened the emotional self-protection they spent years building. But avoidance creates one major psychological illusion: it distorts perception while the relationship is active. Fear speaks louder than clarity. And only after enough distance exists do they finally begin seeing the relationship without the emotional static that once clouded everything. That's why avoidants often need distance to fully understand your value. Presence overwhelms them emotionally because intimacy activates all their fears at once, but absence removes the emotional pressure their nervous system reacts to. Once the relationship is gone, once they are no longer feeling emotionally cornered by closeness, something strange begins happening internally. The emotional defenses slowly lower, and as those defenses lower, clarity begins replacing fear. Suddenly they start remembering things differently. They realize you were not trying to control them, you were trying to connect with them. You were not attacking their independence, you were asking for emotional reciprocity. The reassurance you wanted no longer sounds unreasonable in hindsight because now they can see the relationship without constantly feeling triggered by vulnerability itself. This is why avoidants often seem emotionally clearer after separation than during the relationship. Distance gives them the emotional safety required to process feelings they could not fully access in real time. And once this clarity begins, it can hit them incredibly hard because avoidants usually pride themselves on being emotionally self-protective, logical, and difficult to hurt. So realizing they misunderstood someone genuine creates enormous internal regret, especially when they begin noticing how difficult it is to replace the emotional safety you quietly provided them. And this is usually where the comparison phase begins without them expecting it. They meet new people, have conversations, explore distractions, maybe even attempt new relationships, but little by little, your absence starts exposing itself through contrast. The emotional depth feels different now. The conversations feel less grounding. The connection feels more surface level than what they experienced with you. And perhaps the most unsettling realization for avoidants is discovering that not everyone reaches them emotionally the same way, because avoidants may connect casually with many people, but genuine emotional imprinting is much rarer for them than they admit openly. So once someone truly gets beneath their defenses, that connection lingers long after the relationship ends. New people unintentionally remind them of everything you did differently, the patience you showed during difficult moments, the emotional understanding you offered without trying to dominate them, the safety of being accepted even during their emotional contradictions. And now, without the defensive emotional pressure of the relationship itself clouding their perception, they start recognizing qualities they once overlooked completely. Your emotional consistency no longer feels suffocating. It feels rare. Your honesty no longer feels overwhelming. It feels mature. Your willingness to stay emotionally present during conflict no longer feels threatening. It feels deeply valuable. And this realization slowly forces avoidance into an uncomfortable truth. Maybe they did not lose just another relationship. Maybe they lost someone emotionally difficult to replace. Once that truth settles in, avoidants begin replaying old moments obsessively, especially the ones they misinterpreted at the time. Conversations they once felt defensive during now sound entirely different in hindsight. They remember moments where you were trying to explain your feelings calmly while they emotionally withdrew instead of listening fully. They revisit arguments and suddenly notice how often your frustration came from emotional hurt rather than control. And perhaps the most painful realization is understanding how many times you were trying to love them while they were busy protecting themselves from being loved too deeply. Because avoidants often do not recognize emotional safety while they are inside it. They recognize it once it disappears. That's the tragedy of avoidance. Fear interrupts clarity until loss forces reflection. So now they sit with memories they cannot emotionally dismiss anymore. The moments where you reassured them even when they struggled reassuring you back, the times you gave patience while they gave confusion. The emotional effort you invested trying to understand them while they interpreted your care through suspicion and emotional defensiveness. And this is where regret begins transforming into something heavier than ordinary heartbreak. Because now they are not just missing you, they are confronting the possibility that they misjudged one of the few people who genuinely tried to love them safely. And that realization cuts avoidance far more deeply than they usually let anyone see, because regret feels especially heavy to people who spent most of their life convincing themselves they were emotionally safer, not needing anyone too much. Once avoidants realize they misjudged you, they are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about themselves. Fear distorted their perception more than your behavior ever did. The emotional walls they trusted for protection may have actually caused them to lose someone emotionally rare, and for avoidance, that kind of realization creates a strange form of grief, because now they are not only missing the relationship, they are questioning their own instincts. They start wondering how many moments they misunderstood while trying to protect themselves emotionally. How many times they interpreted your care as pressure simply because closeness itself frightened them. And this is usually where the regret becomes intensely personal. They replay memories where you stayed calm during moments they emotionally withdrew. They remember times you asked for reassurance gently before exhaustion finally replaced patience. They think about the emotional safety you offered without trying to control them, and suddenly the entire relationship looks different in hindsight. What once felt emotionally overwhelming now feels emotionally valuable. What once triggered defensiveness now feels irreplaceable. And avoidants struggle deeply with this phase because underneath their emotional distance is often someone terrified they ruined one of the healthiest connections they were ever given. That's why when avoidants finally begin coming back into your life, the return rarely looks dramatic at first. Most avoidants do not burst back in with overwhelming emotional confessions immediately because vulnerability still feels risky even after clarity arrives. Instead, they usually approach indirectly, carefully, slowly, almost like someone testing whether emotional safety still exists between you. The opportunity they return with is often disguised at first as something small, a casual message, a check-in, a random reason to reconnect. Sometimes it's work-related, sometimes it's framed as friendship, sometimes it's hidden beneath humor or emotional neutrality, but beneath the surface, what they are really doing is searching for emotional re-entry without exposing themselves to immediate rejection. Because avoidants fear vulnerability intensely, especially after realizing they may have been wrong about you all along, so instead of fully expressing everything immediately, they create small openings first, tiny emotional doorways that allow them to gauge your energy before risking deeper honesty. And people often misunderstand this stage because the avoidant may not seem emotional enough outwardly, but internally this cautious return is usually carrying enormous emotional weight. For someone emotionally avoidant, even sending a simple message after long silence can feel psychologically terrifying because it risks shame, rejection, and emotional exposure all at once. At the same time, something else is changing inside them that you may notice almost immediately if you pay attention closely. They are becoming more emotionally aware than before. Loss has a way of forcing reflection onto avoidance that they often resisted during the relationship itself. The loneliness, the emotional contrast between you and other people, the realization that emotional safety is rare, all of it slowly pushes them into self-awareness they previously avoided confronting, and this emotional awareness changes the way they see your past behavior now. They begin understanding your patience differently. During the relationship, your emotional consistency may have felt overwhelming because they interpreted closeness through fear, but now, from a distance, they begin recognizing how emotionally mature you actually were. They realize how many people would not have stayed as patient as you did, how many people would not have tried understanding them beneath the surface, instead of simply reacting to their distancing behaviors. And perhaps the most painful realization for avoidance is understanding that your patience was not weakness, it was emotional strength, real emotional strength, the kind they secretly depended on more than they realized at the time. So now when they look back, they begin respecting things they once resisted emotionally. Your boundaries, your honesty, your emotional clarity. The standards they once viewed as pressure now look like healthy relationship expectations they simply were not emotionally prepared to meet yet. And this shift creates enormous internal conflict because avoidants now find themselves trapped between pride and vulnerability. Part of them wants to fully admit they were wrong. Part of them wants to say, I understand now. I see your value now. I finally realize you were trying to love me, not control me. But another part of them feels deeply ashamed, because admitting they misjudged you means confronting the emotional damage their fear created. It means acknowledging that someone who genuinely cared about them may have walked away emotionally wounded because they could not receive closeness safely at the time. And shame is extremely difficult for avoidants to tolerate because it threatens the emotionally self-sufficient identity they built over years. So now they hover between wanting reconnection and fearing emotional exposure, wanting closeness but struggling to fully surrender their defenses. This is why avoidants often move inconsistently during reconnection phases. One moment they seem emotionally open, warm, reflective. The next moment they retreat slightly again, almost overwhelmed by the vulnerability of realizing how much they actually care. But underneath these fluctuations is usually one powerful emotional truth. They are terrified you may no longer feel the same way. Because by the time avoidants finally recognize your value clearly, they often understand something else too. You may have already emotionally moved forward. And this realization quietly panics them more than they usually admit outwardly. Suddenly they start looking for signs, tiny signs. Your tone in conversations, your response speed, your energy toward them compared to before. Whether you still seem emotionally open or emotionally guarded now. They watch your social media differently, analyze interactions differently, wonder whether someone else has already become emotionally important to you. And this fear changes avoidance because for the first time they are no longer emotionally protected by distance. Now they are emotionally invested while lacking certainty. They are the ones hoping, the ones waiting, the ones trying to figure out whether access to your heart still exists. And this emotional reversal can feel deeply destabilizing for avoidants because it forces them into vulnerability they once unconsciously avoided at all costs. Suddenly they understand what emotional risk actually feels like. The fear of caring deeply without knowing whether the other person still wants you there. The anxiety of wondering whether you waited too long to become emotionally ready. The painful possibility that clarity arrived only after the opportunity itself began slipping away. And this is usually the point where the opportunity they are coming back with begins revealing its deeper emotional meaning. Because on the surface it may look small at first, a conversation, a chance to reconnect, an invitation to work together, talk again, see each other, or rebuild contact slowly. But underneath all of that is something much bigger emotionally. What avoidants are often really asking for is another chance to approach intimacy differently than they did before. Another chance to exist inside the connection without letting fear control every emotional decision. Because once avoidants realize they misjudged you, they begin understanding that losing you was not just losing a relationship, it was losing emotional safety they were not emotionally mature enough to appreciate at the time. And that realization changes the emotional weight behind their return completely. Suddenly the opportunity is no longer just about romance, it becomes about redemption, about whether they can rewrite the emotional ending that now haunts them privately. about whether they can finally become the version of themselves they needed to be when you first loved them sincerely. And what makes this emotionally intense is that avoidants rarely return casually once they fully understand your value. If they truly reached this stage of awareness, the return is usually carrying years of reflection, regret, emotional comparison, and delayed understanding beneath the surface. Because meaningful loss changes avoidance in ways people often underestimate. Most avoidants can emotionally detach from surface-level relationships relatively quickly because those connections never fully penetrated their emotional defenses deeply enough to leave permanent impact. But when someone genuinely reaches beneath those defenses, when someone offers emotional patience, understanding, safety, and consistency in a way that feels rare, that loss lingers differently. It forces internal confrontation. And eventually, avoidants begin realizing that emotional closeness itself was never truly the enemy. The real problem was their fear of needing it. So over time, many avoidants become softer emotionally after losing someone they misjudged. Not weaker, softer, more self-aware. More conscious of the patterns they once defended automatically. They begin noticing how often fear disguised itself as logic during the relationship. How many times they called emotional distance space when it was actually avoidance. How often they resisted vulnerability not because the connection was unhealthy but because intimacy itself